This episode of Bullet Heaven was made possible with a copy of the game provided by Inin Games. Though it's admittedly a series I've been slow to warm up to, we've become more and more receptive to G-Darius and its myriad games over the years. Lately, it seems as if we can't get enough. From the PC Engine to the Mega Drive to PS4, Switch, and everything in between, we've been exploring more and more of what the series has to offer. G-Darius Cosmic Collection, G-Darius Burst ACEX+, heck, even Sagaya on the trusty old Game Boy. The vast wealth of titles to explore has been immense. But one such title we've been looking for an excuse to cover is one we've actually had for a little while now, and it marked the turning point in the series where G-Darius went 3D. Now, Inin Games is back with yet another release for the Nintendo Switch and PlayStation 4, this time from the heyday of the 32-bit era. We were saving this one for a classic review, but there's no time like the present. In this episode of Bullet Heaven, we're taking a look at G-Darius HD. G-Darius originally saw release to arcades in 1997, developed and published by Taito both in Japan and North America. The arcade version would also see a version 2 revision, adding features and tweaking difficulty of the game in general. It was ported to the PlayStation in 1998 and released in all major territories. Taito was the publisher in Japan, while THQ handled North America and Europe. It was based on the version 2 arcade release and added beginner and boss battle modes. Meanwhile, the version 1 arcade release was also made available as part of Taito Memories Volume 2 in Japan and Taito Legends 2 on the PlayStation 2 in North America and Europe. Finally, it would make its way to the PlayStation 4 and Nintendo Switch as G-Darius HD, first from Taito on February 21, 2021 in Japan, then on September 28, 2021 from Inin Games in North America and Europe. It was also included as part of the G-Darius Cosmic Revelation compilation from Strictly Limited Games. Developed by M2, a patch adding the version 2 arcade content has been announced but has not yet been released as of this review. G-Darius fits right on in with other polygonal shoot-'em-up releases of the 32-bit era, but what makes it tick, and how good is it really? Let's take a closer look. Having taken a look at many G-Darius games so far, the general formula here is the same as one might expect from any other game in the series. Players assume control of the iconic Silverhawk starfighter, with hard-8 control. The Silverhawk is pretty swift, maybe a bit too swift at times, and with no variable speed change, collisions may happen more than players expect. The player's main shots and bomb shots are fired at the same time through one single input, in this case the A button by default. As with the square button in the original PlayStation version, players can also press the Y button to fire these shots at a 15-cycle rapid-fire rate. Going even further, the X button will fire shots even faster, allowing for more damage to be dealt faster to enemies that require additional hits to defeat. This is also super helpful for bosses and other features which we'll get into shortly. In each stage, certain enemies will appear that sport different colors than their normal run-of-the-mill versions, typically the last of their formation. As they are destroyed, they'll leave behind an orb for players to collect. Depending on its color, various attributes on the Silverhawk can be upgraded. Red orbs will enhance the Silverhawk's main shots. Green ones will upgrade the bomb shots, and blue will grant a shield to the player that can withstand 3 hits. A matrix in the top corner of the player side of the screen will keep track of all of these collected orbs, and if enough are collected, the attribute in question changes to a new, more powerful form. The main shots, for example, go from missile to lasers to cutters, which pass through enemies and obstacles. Bombs go from 1 shot to 2 to 4. The shield increases from 3 hits to 4 to 5. Care should obviously be taken though. If the player dies, all collected orbs building towards the next level are forfeit. Thankfully, if a feature is upgraded, the Silverhawk will not fall below the achieved level. So that's all well and good, but G-Darius adds a brand new unique feature to the series in the form of capture balls. These are indicated with purple orbs at the bottom of the screen, and can be launched by pressing the B button by default. The capture ball will force any enemy they strike to fight alongside the player, mid-bosses included, so long as they don't sport gold armor. If the player misses, no worries, a capture ball is never lost unless it captures a foe. Additional capture balls to a maximum stock of 6 can also be obtained by collecting purple orbs. Captured enemies have varying degrees of health depending on which have been captured, and their fire patterns will vary widely as well. Exploring the possibilities to see which enemies work best for the player will take time, and adds a good amount of experimentation to the mix, but having these enemies fight alongside the player is only a small part of the overall strategy. Of course, it goes further. In the case of captured mini-bosses known as captains, players can input Street Fighter-style commands to make them use special abilities. Not all mini-bosses have the same input command, but they can be viewed through an in-game capture gallery at any time. These special commands do a decent chunk of damage, and the mini-bosses themselves have quite a bit more health, allowing for players to use them as an impromptu shield if needed. Any captured enemy can also be sacrificed and expended to deal major offensive damage to the player's opposition, particularly against bosses. Pressing the B button again when an enemy has been captured will deploy it like a bomber, which heavily damages enemies and clears away shots in its area of effect. While not a screen-wide effect, it still covers a satisfactory amount of the screen and deals with enemy bullets rather well. On the other hand, pressing and holding the single fire button will absorb the enemy and charge up the devastating Alpha Beam. This beam is absurdly powerful and long-lasting, and rapidly hitting the fire button will also extend its duration slightly. This makes the super fast rapid fire through the X button critical for these attacks. Like the bomber, it too will cancel enemy shots, but the player's rate of movement will be reduced drastically when deployed. The Alpha Beam is best used against bosses though. At certain points in most boss fights, a flurry of additional enemies will make their way onto the playfield. This will give players an opportunity to perform a capture in preparation to deal with the boss's own beta beam. A beam duel can be performed by jamming on the rapid fire button when the two beams meet, and it can get super intense, sometimes resulting in an alpha beam 4 times larger than when it started. These beam duels often end up obliterating the boss in question, and while it can be treacherous even getting to the point where this can be done, the results are more than satisfying. G-Darius features 15 challenging stages, each with a branching mid-stage path allowing for players to explore other parts of the same stage in different playthroughs. These branching paths also feature alternate boss forms, with the lower path often being quite a bit more powerful and much more difficult than the upper path is. Stage progression is otherwise handled like most other Darius games, this time with each stage indicated with Greek letters, from Alpha to Omicron. When each boss is dealt with, players are given a choice between 2 new stages. The higher up the path they choose, the easier it'll be. And we say easier, but the fact is, G-Darius is one of the harder games in the series to make progress in. There are so many spots in which players will likely call bullshit, thanks largely in part to a very cramped, busy screen similar to the kind of thing we've seen in R-Type Delta, Xevious 3DG, and even to a point, Einhander. It just kinda seems like using polygons back in the early days resulted in larger ships and enemies in addition to a more vague hitbox, and G-Darius is no exception. It basically boils down primarily to knowing what enemies should be captured, sacrificed, and used when and where to maximize damage dealt and enemies cleared. Golden orbs can also be found, which are super helpful since, as in other Darius titles, they'll clear the screen of smaller enemies and heavily damage the larger ones. That said, G-Darius HD offers a great compromise for players looking to get better at the game. 16 save states can be utilized to quick save the player's position at any time during the game. We chose to save at various junctures, allowing for us to boot up to a point where any stage in the game could be chosen to practice. Another few of our slots are taken up with especially tricky bosses. It's a great way to get accustomed to everything the game has to offer, though players can't rank in if the save states are utilized. Basically, it all comes together to form a Darius experience unlike anything else, and while we still feel that Darius Gaiden leads the series overall, G-Darius is definitely a top 5 contender, maybe even a top 3. Other quality of life improvements such as M2's helpful gadgets tracking shield strength, alpha beam strength and multiplier values, and bonus item collection adds an additional layer to situational data for the players to keep track of. Though outside of the shield strength, most of it is fluff. A zone gadget might have been much more helpful. There are even online leaderboards letting players stack themselves up to others from around the world, with a small catch, and we'll take a look at that shortly. There's also quite a bit of slowdown throughout the game's HD version as well, which isn't in the PSX release. It's a bit of a drag, but it comes in handy in certain situations, so we're not really complaining. But it's definitely noticeable throughout the entire game. The scoring in G-Darius isn't especially deep, but there are a number of things to take into consideration if playing for a high score is a priority. Firstly, taking out full formations of enemies will net the player a multi-thousand point bonus. These can also be multiplied in various ways. Finishing off a formation with fire from a captured enemy will add a 2x multiplier. Finishing off a formation with a bomber will add a 3x multiplier. And clearing a formation with the alpha beam will bump it up to 4x. Killing off a boss using a boosted alpha beam will also lead to some wild multipliers as well. With a 4-fold beam, the player's multiplier shoots up to 12 times, which can lead to epic payouts for boss kills so long as the beam is what kills it. Additionally, at stage end, if the player gets through the boss fight with a captured enemy in tow, they'll also receive a sizable bonus as it's destroyed before proceeding to the next stage. Players can also uncover silver orbs, which once again make a return as well. Their values will change between 50 and 51,200 points depending on where in the rotation cycle they're collected. There are otherwise no other bonuses to take into consideration until the very end of the game. A final tally that takes the number of lives remaining, total number of mini-bosses captured, alpha beam finishes, and the total number of double, triple, and 4-fold counters performed. Again, the online leaderboards allow for players to stack themselves up with others from around the world, but what about that catch? Well, worryingly, there are a number of top-ranking scores that are just 0. Not a single point. It's a little more than questionable. These scores could be hacked in some kind of way, so until it's sorted out and these scores are wiped, the online scores are kinda moot for now, which is a shame. But if it does get fixed, the online leaderboards are sure to extend the playtime score chasers will have with the game. G-Darius was the first Darius game to be released with a polygonal graphics engine, and while it definitely isn't on the level of, say, Darius Burst, it's still no slouch either. Generally speaking, the low poly-angular look of the visuals works for the kind of enemies that the player will encounter, though the HD side of things does feature a Silverhawk with more polygons than the normal SD version, which is also included here. With exactly the same textures as the arcade and PlayStation versions of the game, there will be some times that G-Darius looks more on the primitive side than it could have, and the interface elements are still more or less in 240p. Something that could really have been spruced up. There are also spots where the visuals jitter around during dynamic camera movement, and that maybe could have stood to be smoothed out, but it's accurate to what the arcade and PlayStation versions exhibited. And of course, who knows how difficult it would have been to even implement this kind of a fix. That aside, we gotta say, the bosses once again are absolutely the standouts of this game. Using the 3D engine to its fullest in this regard, Taito crafted some truly cinematic experiences for a lot of them, especially the Queen and Fire fossils. Then there's the sound. Zutata was in full swing when it came to G-Darius' soundtrack, and while it isn't as iconic as Darius Gaiden's unrivaled OST, its whacked-out, dissonant, off-the-wall compositions are instantly recognizable. While jarring at first, they give G-Darius a personality that stands out against almost anything else of its time, especially in the console scene, Darius Gaiden included. The sound effects here are also generally decent, though the warning sound is a little on the shrill side of things. This aside, everything else has that familiar Darius feel. Now, we don't really know where the G in G-Darius comes from. Maybe the Genesis Silverhawk, which is this version's Silverhawk flavor. We do know that every stage in the game also starts with a green G. Regardless, the plot is decent enough, and this is the first game that Proco and Tiat are not the main protagonists. For those in it for G-Darius' plot, there's also a decent amount of replay to be had due to its 5 different endings. Rounding out the presentation are easy-to-follow menus, a number of wallpapers to fill out the borders, a basic in-game manual that doesn't depend on a website, and a number of galleries to fill out, as well as achievements. Decent. So, how does G-Darius stack up? Let's take a look. With control that might be a touch too fast and significant noticeable slowdown in the HD version, the control in G-Darius HD isn't optimal, at least on Switch. We'll be revisiting the PS4 version at a later date, but on the whole, the control still works really well. This is a very difficult game that will take a lot of time to really map, root out, and strategize depending on the ending or result the player is looking for. Training through the use of save states helps tremendously. G-Darius features 15 stages complete with multiple routes in each, but only 5 can be played in a single run. This leads to a large amount of replayability even without taking the online leaderboards into account. For their time, G-Darius' graphics weren't on the level of, say, Einhander, but they weren't terrible either. They can jitter from time to time, and the textures are very pixelated, but the really cool cinematic boss encounters and general design of the 3D Silverhawk, mini-bosses, and stage bosses are great. The audio is a bit of an acquired taste though. The effects are decent in general, though the warning effect is shrill, but the OST is super whacked out. I love it, but many others will not. G-Darius has awesome ideas with regards to enemy capture and super attack deployment. There's all kinds of strategy for the player to experiment with throughout the game, and we gotta admit, using Street Fighter style move inputs for special mini-boss attacks is excellent. Sporting a moderate price tag of about $30 US, G-Darius HD still has a good value to it, even if it's just G-Darius in the end, and even though the leaderboards are a little broken. For those looking for a blend of old and new in the Darius series, G-Darius HD is the game to play. It has arguably the most fun mechanics of the entire series, not to mention cinematic moments not even Darius Burst could top. Being available on the Switch and the PlayStation 4, new fans can easily experience it for themselves, while veterans from the 32-bit era can relive the glory days with crispier edges and online features. When they get fixed. When it all comes down to it, G-Darius HD is well worth playing. You can get G-Darius HD on the Nintendo eShop or the PlayStation Network store, with physical versions available at retail on October 15th. It's also a part of Darius Cosmic Revelation from Strictly Limited Games. Links below. We have even more shooting goodness on the horizon for October. Dragons, Griffins, and even a resurrected video format are all coming soon on Bullet Heaven. We're also trucking along with a really cool historical piece. We hope that the elements we need for this project come together soon. We'll see you all in the next episode.